Hello, friends.
The Bears are who we thought they were.
The Bears. The Bears.
I am the great Cornholio.
We'll see what happens.
The playoffs?
See, Sean McDonough, Jay Billis. Goats.
Can you play a song? Something cool. Put my mic on!
I'm calling both games.
Oh, baby! Are you serious? Goes down the field for Smith.
Oh, he got it!
Seattle. We're getting ready for Cincinnati.
Are baseball players stealing money? Are they getting away with theft? With highway robbery? Are baseball players committing a crime by getting big contracts? You can say the same thing that maybe NFL quarterbacks are, but baseball contracts are up there as well in terms of total value. And, that leaves a lot of people asking the same question. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? Because, everybody is looking at, looking at Mike Trout's contract from, 3 years ago now in 2019. That was worth $426.5 million total. And they're saying, hey, I've done more than Mike Trout is. Hey, show me the money.
Where is the money?
And, all right, I'd be asking the same question too. Because, and I think maybe teams and experts and media and fans are looking at these contracts and they're saying, what's the point of signing them to this huge amount of money? Because if we're just going to, without question, just, give you all the money in the world that we have, are we getting the return that we expect? Is it worth it? Or should we be spending our money elsewhere? And should we be looking at other alternatives? I'm sure that these baseball players don't care, because as long as they're getting their money and as long as they're hitting the jackpot,
baby!
And rightfully so. I mean, hey, if I'm getting upwards of half a billion dollars, great. That's great by me. And maybe that's not exactly the attitude you should have. And I would agree with that as well. As you probably should be playing for the love of the game and not for the love of money. However, if you are playing an outstanding year and you are having a Hall of Fame caliber career, and you are doing that, then sure, you deserve to get a decent payday. So let's take a look at that issue. Let's take a look at the top 15 most expensive contracts in all of baseball history, in MLB history. 2019, as I mentioned, the LA Angels signed Mike Trout to a 11-year extension worth total value of $426.5 million. 2021, last year, Mookie Betts and the LA Dodgers signed a $365 million contract that is good for 10 years as well. Sorry, 11 years, right? This year, New York Mets signed Francisco Lindor to a $341 million total value contract. The Padres make quite a few appearances in this list as well. As 2019, they gave Manny Machado $300 million, assigned him to a $300 million total value contract. And then last year they paid Fernando Tatis Jr. They signed him to a $340 million total value contract. So out of two players, over the next 10 years or so, over the next 10 to 15 years total, you are paying $640 million to two players. Out of 26 that you can have on your Major League roster, two of them will be getting paid $640 million over the next 10 to 15 years. And the Padres have not made the World Series since those two big signings. They just made the playoffs this year for the first time in quite a while. And yeah, not quite a while, but they made it far in the playoffs for the first time in quite a while. They had the opportunity to get to the World Series. And the Phillies signed Harper. 2019, Marlins with Giancarlo Stanton, the Rangers with Corey Seager. The list goes on and on and on. And I can sit here and tell you values of contracts until the cows come home, and that's all fine and dandy. What's the reason though, and looking at those numbers, you might ask? And I think it's very difficult to, tell what's worth it in terms of baseball, because it's not something that you can say one way or another. You can't just plop out a formula and say, hey, true or false. It's not that simple. It's not, okay, this happened and they paid this money, so therefore it's worth it to spend this X amount of money to get this result. That is kind of up to you. That's kind of up to you, the fan, you, the audience, you, the person looking at the data. What do you see as being worth it? Because everybody sees worth differently, especially in terms of success and paying for, and how much you pay your players for that success. Like, in terms of in football terms, yeah, I'd say it's pretty worth it to pay Mahomes the money that you paid Mahomes. I'd say that was worth it. That was a good investment. Paying Mike Trout, signing him to a 10-year contract worth upwards of sorry, I twisted my words together. Worth upwards, almost $500 million. Not sure that's worth it, as they haven't really gotten better since then. They have not. They've been kind of floating, sinking towards the bottom. They've been hovering the bottom of baseball. And so when I looked at these top 15 largest contracts in MLB history, I looked at not only when they were signed, when the contract was set to expire, how much the total value was, but I also looked at, was this a contract extension, was it a free agent signing, or was it, kind of like, oh, you traded for him the year before and then you signed him to an extension afterward? Because if you had signed him to a contract extension, meaning you already had him on your team before, did signing that guy to an extension make your team any better the year after? If you signed him as a free agent, did that free agent signing really boost your team a significant amount? And we can dive incredibly deep into this. And again, I'm only scratching the surface here. I looked at the record, batting average, ERA, and whether or not the team made the playoffs in both the year before they signed mentioned player to a big contract and the year of signing that player to the contract. So, for example, Mike Trout's contract. He was signed to this massive contract in 2019. So I looked at the 2018 season numbers for the Angels and the 2019 season numbers for the Angels. And I did that across the board for these top 15 contracts. And the problem with that is, how do you look at, does that really tell you whether or not it's worth it? No, I don't think so. I don't think you can look at the signing of one player, and again, either way, I think even if, a team had dramatic improvements from one year to another, say if it was one or two teams that had this, I don't know. I think you have to look deeper into that team to see what was really going on, because I don't think one player can really, I don't think one player is going to take you from, having an okay season or a great season in one year and then transforming you to an elite force in another year. I just don't think there's any one player that you put on a team and all of a sudden you are going to be the best team in baseball. So in these numbers, there are slight improvements and even some slight decreases in stats as well, which was a little bit surprising, but I was expecting to find that somewhat to a certain extent. Because my theory on this was, all right, if you're going to sign a fielder, a hitter, an offensive player to an outstanding contract, to a humongous contract, right? If you go out and pay a ridiculous amount of money to a hitter, does that have an impact on your pitching? Because in my little scenario here, in my world, you pay all that money to the hitter, and then, okay, you look at your other pitchers that might be asking for money and say, hey, sorry, we just gave all the money to Mike Trout, so we can't keep you. And then they go and sign mediocre, average pitchers, and the pitching numbers fall. To a certain extent, that was true in the case of the LA Angels. In 2018, their ERA was 4.15. In 2019, their ERA dropped to over 5. Their record actually got worse between those years, and they didn't make the playoffs in either of those years. Now, their batting average, okay, you kept Mike Trout on the team, and this is kind of an interesting scenario where you had him on the team in 18, right? So how much can you really expect the numbers to change if it's the same player, if it's a player on the same team from year to year? Just putting the numbers out there. The LA Dodgers with Mookie Betts. All right, maybe that's a better thing to look at. And also, though, maybe not, because here's another problem in this, is that looking at the year before, right, he was signed to his contract in 2021. Well, the year before that was the year where they only played, 70 games it was? 60 games, sorry. Yeah, they played a 60-game season in 2020 due to the MLB lockout, COVID-19 pandemic scheduling bubble thing, right? That whole debacle. So can you really take stats from a 60-game season and compare them to that of a 162-game season? That's kind of a tough sell for me, right? That is, I would have a tough time being convinced of that from someone else. So I'm not going to try to sit here and say, well, in the 60-game season they had this number, and in the 161-game season they had this, and they were worse in the 161-game season, so there's a problem there. No, because, okay, 60 games is completely different than 162, and it doesn't take a genius to figure that out. So, all right. Let's go to the third one down. New York Mets, Francisco Lindor. He was signed in 2022. His last season before that, 2021, we should be in good shape, right? Wrong. He was acquired via trade in 2021, and 2021 was a bad year for the Mets, all right? There were way more things that changed over the course from 2021 to 2022 other than Francisco Lindor, all right? They got rid of their manager in 2021. New manager in 2022, Buck Showalter. They also signed Adam Ottavino and Max Scherzer, among other decent pitchers, added that to an already decent pitching staff. Francisco Lindor, sure, he helps. Sure, is an added piece. Their batting average did improve a decent amount. Their ERA also got better. They did make the playoffs in 2021. They won 40 more games. They won about 30 more games in 2022 than they did in 21, and they made the playoffs this year, which they did not last year. However, I don't think you can really look at these numbers and say, well, okay, they won 30 more games this year because they signed Francisco Lindor. Again, as I mentioned before, you'd have to take a deeper look into it, and you'd have to say, okay, well, look, there's all these other reasons for their success. They did all these other different things, so it's not just about signing Francisco Lindor. All right. Let's go to number 4. Tatis Jr. Let's not do that. That was a 2021 signing. 2020, again, I'm not going to try to sell you. I'm not going to try to pitch my opinion and sell it to you and persuade you to believe an opinion based off a 60-game season compared to a 162-game season. That's just not. That is not realistic. All right. That's fine. Let's go to number 5. Bryce Harper with the Philadelphia Phillies. 2019, he was signed to a 12-year contract. Total value of $330 million. All right, take a look. 2018, they were 80-82. They had the league worst. If I can get this chart out of the way, they had the league worst. MLB worst batting average. their ERA was average for the MLB. They missed the playoffs, and in 2019 rather, they were one game better record-wise. Their batting average improved slightly, and their ERA did take a little bit of a tumble. They also missed the playoffs in 2019. However, this was another thing I was mentioning at the introduction part of the segment. Can you really base a difference on just 2 seasons on worth? Do you expect to have immediate success? Is it really realistic to, look at this and say, well, okay, they did X in the year before they signed this guy, and then when they did sign him to this massive contract, he didn't really do. The team didn't really have that different of a season. Like the improvement, when evident, was not game changing. Are we going to stop there and say, okay, one season, because they didn't drastically improve in one season, it's not worth it? Because if I recall, there was a lot of other things going on with the Phillies 3 or 4 years ago than just Bryce Harper. It wasn't like you took Bryce Harper and added him to the best league in baseball, and it's like, okay, well, why are we going 500? There was plenty of other things going on with the Phillies. And look at them now. Now they're in the World Series. So is it worth it to sign Bryce Harper? I think a lot of Phillies fans would say, yeah, I would rather have Bryce Harper on my team than not. And you know what? Signing him, maybe our pitching staff isn't all that great, but we still have good pitchers. We still have, Zach Wheeler, Aaron Nola, Alvarado. Like we had, and they traded for Syndergaard this season. This team, it's not just Bryce Harper and then, you signed him to a massive contract and you couldn't afford to have any good pitching at all and the pitching is terrible. No, they still have decent pitching. They still have serviceable pitching. And they also have Kyle Schwarber, Rhys Hoskins, just to name a few. They have some good hitters other than Bryce Harper. So it's not like, oh, you signed him to this big contract and you couldn't sign anybody else, which is what I wanted to look at. I wanted to figure that out. So, okay, is it worth it? That's up for you. That's up to you to decide. I think you can't look at I don't think you can look at all the big contracts to be signed ever and say, well, it's not worth it in general. I don't think you can make a blanket statement and say, oh, it's not worth it. End of story. It's depending on the situation. In some spots, yeah, it might be worth it. And in some spots, no, it's absolutely not worth it. Like the Marlins, for example. And sure, they traded him so the other team gets the salary. And, that's always kind of a sketchy thing to deal with. But the Marlins in 2015 signed Giancarlo Stanton to a 12-year, $325 million contract. And then they traded him 2 years later. Then, okay, well, same thing happened with Nolan Arenado. Signed to a big extension with the Rockies in 2019. He was traded 2 years later to the Cardinals. Alex Rodriguez in 2001 signed a pretty decent-sized contract. At the time, that was record-breaking. And then he was traded to the Yankees 3 years later in 2004. So in those scenarios, maybe no, it wasn't worth it, right? But in some other scenarios, yeah, it was worth it, New York Yankees signed Garrett Cole to a huge contract. I'd say so far that's been pretty worth it. He's been their best pitcher. Yeah, that was worth it. So again, I don't think you can make a blanket statement and say, oh, because it's not worth it for any team. You can't look at the Orioles and say, oh, they signed Chris Davis that massive contract and look at how that paid out for him. That didn't work out so well. No, it's not worth paying baseball players huge contracts, because you could look at it the other side of you and say, look at the Yankees. They signed Garrett Cole to a huge contract. He's been their best pitcher, and he a lot of the Yankees pitching success can be credited to and can be attributed to Garrett Cole. So yeah, I think that in that scenario, yeah, it's worth it. But just like I can't make a blanket statement and say, oh, because of this, it's not worth it, I also can't go the other way around and say, yeah, because of this, it is worth it. It's depending on the scenario, and it's still it's a difficult thing, right? There's no easy answer, because if there was, we wouldn't be seeing this huge disparity. And, this year, even now, right, we want to take a look at the Angels, right? All right, maybe looking at one season is not enough to say whether it's worth it, just like I mentioned with Bryce Harper. Well, the Angels still are irrelevant. The Angels are still doing absolutely nothing. So in that scenario, I'd say maybe no. Maybe that contract was not worth it to be signing Mike Trout to that huge contract. But that's depending on the scenario. And it's always a gamble to sign players to huge contracts, because there's no guarantee that you're going to win a World Series because of it. I mean, hindsight's 2020, but the Orioles probably should have signed Nelson Cruz to a extension over Ubaldo Jimenez. Not probably, they definitely should have. And at the time, maybe that seemed like a no-brainer, but who knows? You don't know for sure until that scenario plays out.